Chapter 9. Zekalov watched his father walk out and couldn't help but morbidly wonder if he would ever see him again. The child turned his head when the sound of a throat clearing caught his attention. Count Dooku stood just above him and stared into the Kalish child's golden eyes with his own red-hued irises. "Now that you are in my care, there are a few rules you must follow. First, you are not permitted to leave the premises without my permission." Zekalov nodded with wide eyes and continued to listen to his new master. He tried to remember everything his father told him and maintained eye contact with the Sith Lord despite the fact it made him feel incredibly insecure. He hated doing it. Especially when all he saw in those Sith eyes of his was darkness and hate. Second, you will obey my every command. Failure to do so will bring you great pain. Count Dooku began to slowly circle him. The youngling never took his eyes off of him, feeling very distrustful. Thirdly, your life is now bound to me. You will either complete your training with me successfully or you will die as a result of your failure. That of course is completely up to you. Do you understand me, child? Zekalov nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Dooku suddenly stopped and backhanded him with a growl. Zekalov cried out in shocked pain and nearly lost his footing, taken completely by surprise by such an unforeseen action. You will only, ever, address me as master. Zekalov felt tears stinging his eyes but held them back, knowing he had to be strong. He stood up straight and nodded. Why yes, master. I am rather surprised your father did not already teach you this. It's just another one of his many failures. Whatever fear and insecurity Zekalov was feeling drained away. He raised his head as he felt his anger rising. He clenched his hands into fists and narrowed his eyes defiantly at the Count. You are not my master then. Quick as lightning, Zekalov was backhanded again, only this time it did knock him over. He placed a hand on his stinging face and looked up at the man with fear in his eyes. Dooku frowned in displeasure as he towered over him. You would be wise to learn that insubordination and disrespect will cost you dearly in the future. The child shrank back as he felt the anger rising in the force from Dooku and had the frightening feeling that this man had no qualms about seriously hurting him. Zekalov remained silent as his defiant spark burned out. He lowered his head submissively and nodded. Yes, master. He climbed back up to his feet and stared at the floor, unable to meet the hard stare of the Sith Lord. He felt the urge to cry but squandered his hurt feelings and replaced it with anger. He looked back up at Dooku and met his stare dead on. You will go now to your assigned quarters and remain there until I send for you. While you are alone, I suggest you meditate. We must hone your Force abilities, my apprentice. There is much you need to learn. Dooku placed a hand on Zekalov's shoulder, no longer angry or menacing. The boy suppressed a flinch at the man's touch. This man was not his father and the child could see right through his fake facade. The Count only pretended to care about him. He already hating being here and they hadn't even started his training yet. He did everything in his power to hide his true feelings. If the Count could sense it, he showed no indication that he had. I will go now and do as you say, master. Count Dooku nodded his consent for him to take his leave. The child bowed to him and left to go do as instructed, quite relieved to be out of the Sith Lord's presence. A protocol droid showed him to his room. He entered and was quite surprised to find it so lavishly furnished. There was a rather large bed with crimson blankets and large, fluffy white pillows. There was a huge black and silver threaded rug that carpeted the majority of the floor. Red draperies were pushed back to either side of the one window that graced the room. Red seemed to be the main theme in Dooku's fortress, a color the child wouldn't doubt that he would soon come to despise. The child walked in and continued to inspect his new living space. There was a walk-in closet with ample space and he had his own bathroom. The bathroom in itself was amazing. Ivory comprised the sink and bathing area and was decorated in silver and gold. He felt completely bewildered and turned to look at the silver protocol droid that was still standing in the doorway. Are you sure this is my room? Yes. Count Dooku's orders. Will you be in need of anything else, Master Zekalov? It was really weird having someone, even a droid, call him Master. He shook his head. No thanks. I'll be fine for now. As you wish, Master. If you require any assistance, the call button is to the left on the comm station. The droid turned and left. The doors slid shut behind him. Zekalov saw the button the droid spoke of on a brightly lit panel near the door. As the last of the dying light from the setting sun filtered through the window, the child closed the curtains and the automatic lights triggered on. The lights were rather dim and not at all bright like the ones on his father's ship. He went and sat in the middle of the bed and hugged his knees to his chest. He closed his eyes and felt a sad, wistful longing to return to his father. Father, I wish you were here. He closed his eyes and began to meditate. There was no sense to disobey his new master now. The child heeded his father's warnings concerning the punishments the old man would surely reap upon him if he did. Zekalov now knew that Dooku would hurt him if he tried. He submerged himself in the Force and in an instant, he was no longer in the Sith abode. He was standing in a cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot's seats just in front of him. There were 3 Jedi that he had never seen before, 2 of them in the pilot's chairs and the third standing just behind the young man that was currently piloting the craft. One of the 3 Jedi was a Togruta youngling, perhaps a few years older than himself. He listened intently to their conversation. Looks like this was quite a battle. The ship maneuvered through the debris field left from the space battle between Grievous's fleet and the Republic ships where the clone commandos sacrificed their lives in a valiant attempt to accomplish their mission. They searched the area for an hour, looking for any clues that would give them an idea where their enemy had gone next and came up empty-handed. Maybe we should head back to the temple. They are long gone now, Obi-Wan sighed in disappointment. I really don't think we should give up so easily. Anakin argued. Anakin, we have no way of tracking Grievous's fleet. They could be on the other side of the galaxy, for all we know. What if you guys adjusted our scanners to detect traces of their iron trail? The youngling suggested. Anakin and Obi-Wan shared a look and then looked back at the child. I tried that when we first arrived, however. Anakin began to recalibrate his instruments. I might be able to reroute power from our auxiliary weapons to boost the frequency of our scanners. The young man finished making adjustments and then nodded to the youngling. All right, Ahsoka, sweep the area again. The young girl hit a switch on the forward console and a green panel lit up. A blue beam of light shot forward from the belly of their ship and began to scan the debris field around them. There is a faint trail, however it abruptly ends, indicating that they clearly jumped to light speed. We are back to square one, Obi-Wan massaged his temple as though he had a headache. I say we keep looking. They could be in a nearby star system, Anakin gestured out the forward viewport. He was a stubborn one. You guys are forgetting, we aren't necessarily trying to find General Grievous. But his son, Obi-Wan reminded them. Wouldn't the son be with the father? Anakin raised an eyebrow in question. Obi-Wan thought about it for a moment. Unless the Sith already have him. That is one very real possibility. The 3 Jedi remained silent a moment deep in thought, and then all 3 looked at each other, Anakin letting out a growl. Dooku. He would be the one to train the boy. Do you think he already has him? The only way Dooku would train the child is if his apprentice, Asajj Ventress, was dead. There can only be one master and one apprentice at any given time. So if we find her, we find him. Obi-Wan rubbed his bearded chin in thought, possibly. For now we need to return to the Jedi Temple and regroup. Perhaps Master Yoda can offer us some wisdom and insight on the matter. All right, let's get out of here. The 3 Jedi maneuvered their ship out into open space and jumped to lightspeed. Zekalov was rather surprised when his meditation ended. That didn't seem a bit like the usual foresight-based visions. Did that conversation he just heard actually happen right now, in the present? It sure seemed like it. He closed his golden yellow eyes and centered himself. He delved back into the Force and he could see both light and dark. The dark side beckoned for him as it usually did. The Kaleesh youngling was already trained enough by Dooku to know that the dark side was the only side of the Force he was ever supposed to use. He was very curious, what would happen if he tapped into the light side of the Force, just this once? Zekalov had to appease his curiosity and reached for the light side. It felt soothing and sweet and filled him with vibrant energy that was pure and good. The child was amazed and never imagined the light side of the Force would feel like this. He tentatively began to search for his father's faint Force signature. It was very difficult, using the light side. It seemed so much easier to find his father when he used the dark side. Suddenly he felt someone very powerful reaching through the Force and touched him. He was pulled into another vision. He was standing inside of a room with many windows. He looked out a window to see a huge city. This had to be Coruscant. He'd seen pictures of the planet during his studies with Captain Selvk. This place he was in now, it had to be the Jedi Temple. He wasn't for certain, it was just a feeling he had. He heard a humid chuckle and snapped his head around. He pulled his training saber from his belt and got into a fighting stance. There in the center of the room was a small, short little green Jedi, sitting on a couch. The Jedi was clothed in customary Jedi robes and had a short walking stick next to him. His bare feet hung over the edge of the furniture and he beckoned Zekalov to approach him with the wave of a hand. "Come here, you must." The Kaleesh youngling growled angrily and narrowed his golden yellow eyes. "Why should I?" His hate for the Jedi began to rise within him, but there was something about this Jedi that gave him a sense of calm and peace, despite his dark and tumultuous feelings. "Talk to you, I must." Zekalov felt uncertain and took a hesitant step towards him. "Who are you?" "Master Yoda, am I." "What is this? A dream?" The green Jedi chuckled again and shook his head. "A dream it is not. Meditating you are. Found you I have." You were looking for me?" Yoda nodded his head. "Looking for the son of General Grievous, we have been." Zekalov laughed as if he'd heard a good joke. "You really think that I'm his son?" Yoda nodded and stared into Zekalov's golden yellow eyes, the eyes that were practically identical to General Grievous's own. "The son of General Grievous, you are?" "Know this as truth, I do." The Kaleesh youngling crossed his arms and glared at him. "You've got the wrong person. I'm not his son." Yoda slid down from the furniture he was lounging on and grabbed his walking stick. He slowly began to walk towards him and pointed the stick at him. "Lying to me, you are. Find you, we will." Zekalov began to panic and backed away from him and shook his head. "No. Stay back." The child tried to pull himself out of the vision, but the Jedi Master was very powerful. "To save lives and end the war, find you we must. Leave me alone. Go away." Zekalov cried and tried to find a way out. He was pulled violently out of his meditation when something hard collided with his head, knocking him over. He lost his connection with the light side of the Force instantly. He scrambled up and activated his training saber. He screamed, still feeling very disoriented, and had a hard time coming to his senses as the Vision and reality blurred together. "You'll never find me. Stay away." His eyesight began to clear and he saw the menacing figure of Count Dooku glaring at him from across the room. Zekalov felt something near his foot and looked down. There was a child-sized boot, one that the Kaleesh youngling had left at the foot of his bed. He had a growing suspicion that Dooku had thrown it forcefully at his head. Zekalov uttered a cry of dismay when the Sith Lord used the Force to rip his yellow training saber out of his grasp and pulled it into his own outstretched palm and deactivated it. "Tell me in great detail, child, everything that you saw and heard during your meditation." Zekalov nodded meekly and recounted the first vision, the one with the 3 Jedi. He was very reluctant to tell Dooku about his encounter with the Jedi Master, afraid to openly admit he had disobeyed him. The Count could sense the child was attempting to hide something from him but was already aware of what had occurred. And then you experienced another vision, did you not? Zikalov inwardly groaned. How did his master know? Well, Poodoo. There was no way he could hide it from him now. The Sith Lord had probably sensed the connection he had with the light side of the Force while he had been meditating. Now he knew he was in serious trouble. His shoulders sagged in defeat. Yes, Master. Tell me everything. He explained his encounter with Yoda and sensed a growing darkness building up around the Sith Lord. When he was finished, he nervously wiped his sweaty palms on the sides of his black plants. Dooku pondered what he had just heard and frowned. The Jedi know of your existence and I'm holding your father responsible. They have already begun to search for you. Fortunately, your true whereabouts are still unknown to them. Your father will be punished for such a serious mistake as will you. Dooku shook the deactivated lightsaber hilt at the child in disapproval. What are you going to do to my father? If I were you, I'd be more concerned about what I'm going to do to you. The Sith Lord slowly advanced upon the helpless youngling. Zikalov backed away fearfully when he sensed the anger rising in his master. You foolish child, you used the light side of the Force and our most hated enemy contacted you. For that, you will be severely punished, Zikalov cried out in dismay when an invisible force lifted him high up in the air until he was about 3 feet away from hitting his head on the ceiling. Zikalov had a really bad feeling that something terrible was going to happen to him and began to drown in his fear, but then remembered his father's words. He closed his eyes and focused on the memory, almost hearing his father's voice again. True warriors don't fear anything. He began to overcome his fear but failed when invisible hands wrapped around his neck and began to choke him. He kicked and squirmed and clawed at the invisible hands, desperately trying to suck in at least one life-sustaining breath. You better listen to me and obey me in the future, child, or suffer the consequences. Zikalov couldn't focus on what his master said as he drowned in his fear and despair. Just as he began to lose consciousness, he was slammed violently into a wall. Stars exploded in his vision, and he could no longer tell up from down. He was fortunate his ribs didn't crack from the impact. Dooku released his hold on the Kaleesh youngling and the child fell 5 feet to the ground where he landed in a painful heap. He immediately sucked in life-giving air that his starving lungs had been so cruelly deprived of. Once he had recovered, Dooku spoke to him after he was sure he had the boy's attention. Use the light side of the Force again, and I will kill you, Zikalov. That is the only warning I intend to give you. Count Dooku tossed the training saber hilt back at the child. It landed heavily next to Zikalov's feet. Your real training begins in the morning. I suggest you try to get your rest. You're going to need it. With those words, his master left the room. He felt hot, angry tears brimming in his eyes and picked up the lightsaber hilt. He clenched it tightly in a small, clawed hand and growled softly. He was really beginning to hate the man. Had it not been so late, he would have drowned in a sea of emotion, but he was actually pretty tired and the whirlwind of emotion he had just been feeling drained away. He showered and pulled his night clothes on and crawled wearily into bed. He kept his training weapon next to him. The child was not as traumatized at his near-death experience at Dooku's hands as he had been when the Mew Mew had nearly killed him a few years ago. If Zikalov could survive that, then surely he could survive whatever else that evil man could throw at him. He felt afraid at the prospect of Dooku punishing his father. After what the old man just did to him while he was a mere child, he could only imagine what the Sith Lord had in store for his father, as far as punishments went. He fell into an uneasy sleep. He began to dream rather vividly. He was back aboard his father's ship. He saw his father talking with Captain Self before he turned and went down to the hangar bay to greet Dooku, who had just arrived. He talked a while with the Count, and the child shook his head and choked back a sob at what his master said next. Because of your foolish blunder, the Jedi have learned of your son's existence. You have failed me. Now you will suffer for it. Before Grievous had a chance to defend himself, Dooku sent a powerful surge of Force lightning through the Kaleesh cyborg. His father shrieked in agony and writhed on the ground. When the Sith Lord was finished a moment later, he glared daggers at his subject. Fail me in general and I'll be sure your son shares in your next punishment. Dooku turned his back on him and boarded his shuttle. The Sith Lord left the hangar bay moments later. Zekalov saw the smoldering heat rising off of Grievous's duranium armor. Grievous growled out a pain-filled moan and struggled to rise from his present position on the floor. He was racked by an agonizing cough and slowly sat up. His dream changed from one of foresight into a nightmare. Zekalov ran to his father's side. "Father." He reached a hand out to help him and felt an icy tendril of fear race down his spine as the light faded into a red hue. Grievous grabbed Zekalov's arm in a bone-crunching grip and pulled him near, his voice now distorted and sounding warbled as his warm mask melted. "Kill the Count, before he kills you." Zekalov bolted awake in bed with a soft cry and sighed in relief when he realized it had all been a dream. Was that what Dooku planned to do to his father? He had a hard time going back to sleep after that. He tossed and turned for what felt like hours and finally managed to drift off in a dreamless slumber, completely unaware of what his new master had planned for him tomorrow. Chapter 10. Zekalov was up at first light the next morning. The fact that he was sleeping in a totally foreign and unknown, possibly quite dangerous, environment kept him on edge. He made sure to get dressed in his black apprentice attire and polished his training saber hilt. After washing his face with warm water, he then braided his hair as his father had shown him weeks before. He wanted to make a good impression on his first day of training with Count Dooku. The boy felt it unwise to eat his first meal of the day. There was no telling what would happen during his training session or how hard his drills would be. The last thing he wanted to do was upchuck his breakfast and not only humiliate himself but most likely earn a harsh punishment from his new master as well. Zekalov knew from experience that it was far better to err on the side of caution than to risk wrath and ruin. He sat at the foot of his bed and waited for Dooku to summon him. The child felt incredibly nervous. He wished his father was with him. He could only imagine what he would say. He closed his golden reptilian eyes and remembered another time that he had been nervous. Flashback. The young 7-year-old was very hesitant and took a step back with a shake of his head. He felt anxiety to the point of near panic as his father stood on the other side of the room, leaving his young son in the middle of the training arena where he would engage in his first sparring match with a training droid. He was so scared he felt sick and clutched a clammy hand to his stomach as he stared wide-eyed at the very intimidating-looking droid. "Will it hurt me if I mess up?" "It has the potential to harm, yes. So I suggest you destroy it quickly." Zekalov looked incredibly unsure and looked at his father with a worried frown. Grievous began to walk in his direction with a growl. "It will not severely injure or kill you." General Grievous coughed a little and then knelt down and looked Zekalov square in the eyes as he gently grasped the child's shoulder. "Put aside your fear. You are nervous only when you allow your mind to dwell on the possibility of failure. Think only of the thrill of battle. Focus on eliminating your enemy and think on nothing else. Sometimes in the middle of battle, you don't have time to think and must simply act." Zekalov nodded silently and smiled at what his father said next. "You are descended from a line of great warriors. You wouldn't be here today if any of them had succumbed to their fear. Once you learn to master your fear, you can strike terror into the hearts of your enemies. That's when you will be unstoppable." End flashback. The Kalish youngling smiled at the memory. His father was right. Amazingly enough, he did overcome his fear during his first sparring match against the droid and acted on instinct during the fight. It was an incredible motivational booster to win after the droid managed to get a lucky swing in with its training saber. Criff, did that hurt? Needless to say, he wasn't afraid after that. He wanted more than anything to beat the scrap out of the emotionless hunk of junk and declare victory. Now he would be sparring against Dooku. An opponent who would show him no mercy, an opponent who was much older and far more experienced and that was probably impossible to beat. The child sighed. He knew he had to be brave. The child's thoughts began to wander again. He wondered how long it would be before he was privileged with the chance to speak with General Grievous again. Zikalov was pretty sure that Dooku would frown upon him if he requested a comlink in which to contact his father with. His new master already made it clear that he, Count Dooku, was now his sole guardian and caretaker. Not to mention he overheard some conversations between the Count and General Grievous and learned that the Sith Lord was keeping the rest of their Kalish family in an unknown location. The child sensed within the dark aura of the Force that emanated from the Count that the Sith Lord wanted to keep him apart from his father. The boy didn't understand why. That's when he hatched a brilliant idea. During the times when he was not training with Dooku, he would work on building his own long-distance communicator. The child was very intelligent for his age and showed an aptitude for mechanical and electrical engineering during his studies aboard his father's ship. The boy would salvage what parts he needed over the course of time with complete secrecy. Zikalov decided he would only contact his father if it was a dire emergency. He had no doubt that his father would come to his rescue. The only trick was concealing the communicator from the Count. The Sith Lord already had a keen knack for sensing if he was trying to hide something from him or not. It actually creeped Zikalov out a lot. It was very unsettling. It only made sense when his father had that ability. The child came to the conclusion after a self-examination that maybe he himself was just a bad liar. The Kalish youngling decided then and there that he would work on that. He had a feeling if he wanted to survive with the hostile Sith Lord, he would have to master the art of deception. A faint beeping noise and small blinking red light originating from the comm panel alerted him to the fact that someone was paging him. He slid off the bed and went over and hit the answer button. "Come, my apprentice, and meet me in the training room." Immediately. The connection was cut before he could reply. He released a long-suffering sigh and straightened his posture, inhaling a deep breath. He would make his father proud. He left his room and bumped into his personal protocol droid. "Excuse me, Master Zikalov. I have come to retrieve you. Please, follow me." The child followed the droid slowly. "Do you have a name?" "I have no current designation. My serial number is S74470903. Zikalov shook his head with a frown. "There is no way I'm going to call you droid or even try to remember a serial number like that. Everyone should have a name. I guess I'll have to make one up for you then." The child furrowed a brow in thought. He didn't have a chance to think up a good name in time because in less than 2 minutes they had entered the training room where Count Dooku was waiting for him. "I'll have to give you a name later," Zikalov whispered in farewell. The silver protocol droid left wordlessly. Which was kind of odd. Protocol droids were usually pretty talkative. Maybe Dooku altered its programming or something. The human did seem to enjoy silence. He bowed to his master and awaited his command. "Your first lesson begins now." The Sith Master ignited 2 red training sabers and held one in each hand. At least he hoped they were training sabers. Zikalov was very unsettled by this. He had come to be rather proficient in lightsaber dueling thanks to his father's strict lessons that often involved some kind of physical pain if he didn't obey instruction to the letter. He had learned how to fight 2 opponents at once, both opponents being simple training droids. This, however, he was not prepared for. He had never in all his life had to fight a dual-wielder before. "Scheisnik, I'm in for it now." Zikalov cleared his mind and recalled everything his father had taught him. Even with all of that knowledge, he was not prepared for what came next. Dooku swung one lightsaber which he blocked perfectly, and then the child ducked to avoid the other. That was when the first saber he had managed to block struck him painfully in the left shoulder. The pain distracted him enough that he lost concentration and cried out in pain when another lightsaber struck his right thigh and then caught him underneath his leg and flipped him up so that he came crashing down on his back. His lightsaber had flown from his grip right after he fell, and he looked wide-eyed at his master, who was crouched in victory right above him with one end of a lightsaber pointed at his chest and the other tip aimed a few inches away from his neck. "Now tell me, child, what was your first mistake?" Zikolov thought about it for a moment. He didn't dare show any sign of weakness by admitting that he had been distracted by or had even felt pain, despite the fact the traitorous cries had escaped his lips. How best to word it then? I wasn't prepared. I don't know how to fight someone with 2 lightsabers. Dooku frowned down at him in disapproval and straightened back up, extinguishing his lightsabers. It matters not how many weapons an opponent may wield. Think harder. What crucial element were you missing in the fight? Zikalov's face dawned with sudden realization a few seconds later when he realized he hadn't for 1 second used the Force to help him predict Dooku's moves. He had only been focused mentally on trying to counter 2 Griffin lightsabers. In the past, when he trained with his father, the Force never played a part in it since his father wasn't Force-gifted. He learned how to fight the old-fashioned way, as any Kalish might. I didn't use the Force, Master. That's mistake number 1. When Dooku noticed his apprentice was missing his training saber, his expression turned dark. Where is your training saber, boy? Zikalov's golden eyes widened in disbelief and he leapt into action and crawled on hands and knees, frantically beginning to search for it. He felt pain explode in his abdomen as a merciless, booted foot connected with his body, sending him flying. Losing your training saber is mistake number 2. That's 1 mistake too many. Dooku snarled at him in anger. Before Zikolov could scramble back up to defend himself, he was assaulted with more kicks to his small body. He elicited cries of pain and tried to escape the physical beating his master was inflicting upon him. He closed his eyes and gritted his teeth as he felt anger beginning to rise within him. So he made 2 crippling mistakes, and now this was the result? His father had never been this cruel to him. The Kalish youngling was kicked again and he slid across the floor. Seconds later, he found his back against a wall. He punished himself internally. His father had tried to warn him of this. He couldn't hold back pained whimpers and choked on sobs as he curled in on himself and continued to receive the abuse. Please stop, Master, I'm sorry. Hot tears began to squeeze out of his tightly closed eyes and he felt a growl building in his throat in pained anger. His master continued to savagely beat him and snarled at his apprentice. Because of your stupidity you would now be dead because of your failure. The child's hopelessness and despair began to fade the angrier he got. He soon found himself screaming in rage. Stop it. Just stop it. In his rage and in a final act of desperation, the son of General Grievous summoned the Force, and to his surprise, he powerfully Force pushed his master off of him. He leapt to his feet with a growl and got into a fighting stance. His body throbbed and sharp pain lanced through his extremities, which were the areas of his body that received the worst of it as he had been trying to protect his sensitive midsection. That was when he noticed his abandoned training saber lying about 2 feet away. He leapt for it and Combat rolled back to his feet and ignited it, holding it in front of him protectively. He sniffled and wiped the hot tears away with the sleeve of his training tunic. He glared hatefully at Dooku and couldn't hold back a feral little growl. The Sith Lord had already recovered from the unexpected Force push and was clapping his hands slowly from across the room. He gave Zikolov a cold smile. You have great anger. Anger leads to hate, and hate is what gives a Sith power and strength. However, it is never acceptable to disrespect or rebel against your master in any shape or form. Lashing out at me with the Force is considered an act of rebellion and will always carry a heavy price. A price that you must now pay. His training saber was ripped out of his grasp by the Force and went straight to Dooku's hand, leaving the child completely helpless and exposed. Zikolov had a very bad feeling about what the punishment might be. Icy cold fear gripped his heart when the Count raised both hands in his direction and both recognized from his dreams and instinctively knew what the Sith Lord was about to unleash upon him. He really hoped he was wrong, but unfortunately his assumptions were correct when blue bolts of Force lightning shot out of the elder man's hands and tore through Zikalov's body, sending the boy crashing to the ground where he convulsed and screamed on the ground in pure agony. If he thought the pain from the beating was bad, this was probably 10,000 times worse. His punishment continued mercilessly for a few minutes more, in which time he had screamed his throat raw and his clothes were smoldering from the heat. His convulsing body began to lessen as he began to drift in and out of consciousness. His tortured body was finally reaching its limit. Was he going to die now? For the first time in his entire existence, he really hoped so. Zikolov knew that's not what his father would want of him. Wishing for death was cowardly. The only time it wasn't considered so was when wishing for an honorable death as a warrior on the battlefield. He was a warrior in the making, and the child didn't want to go out this way. He didn't want to give Dooku the pleasure or the honor of slaying him. Not that there was much honor to be had out of killing a helpless, defenseless youngling. He was hardly aware that his torture had finally ended as remnants of the Force lightning continued to cause painful muscle spasms. He remained paralyzed on the ground as the deepest aches he'd ever felt in his life bit down into his very bones. He shuddered for breath and felt his heart beating erratically in his chest. He was too weak to even attempt to get back up. Dooku stood above him, looking down at him with mock pity. "I trust you have learned valuable lessons today, my apprentice. You are dismissed for the remainder of the day. Training will commence again at first light tomorrow morning." With those words, the Count left him lying on the ground, most likely to return to his study. Zikolov was relieved to watch him leave through blurry vision. He didn't care where the Krith the evil Sith Lord went, so long as it was far away from him. He moaned softly as he attempted to sit up but found that he couldn't just yet, the pain was so great. He curled up on the cold hard ground and cried softly as his mind traveled to the one person that he knew would always hear him. Zikolov whimpered out one word that brought him a minuscule measure of comfort. "Father." The child finally succumbed to his injuries and he fell into the blissful dark void that was unconsciousness. Now free from a cruel world of pain. General Grievous cackled madly in triumph as the last of his enemies were slain. The Kaleesh cyborg pulled his lightsaber out of the armored chest of a clone trooper. He and his mechanized troops just destroyed a Republic garrison that had been charged with the task of keeping this particular installation up and running. It was a communications tower that enabled Republic forces to coordinate military operations from this corner of the galaxy with other neighboring star systems. This small victory crippled any chance the Republic had of coordinating a counterattack against the Separatist fleet that was about to invade a neutral planet about 2 parsecs away. After General Grievous ensured that the newly acquired communications outpost was seized and truly under Separatist control, left and returned to his flagship to prepare for the imminent invasion and, if necessary, bloody assault. Should the populace of that planet attempt to resist them? While he was walking towards the bridge, he staggered, quite surprised when he thought he heard Zikolov's voice. It sounded weak and pain-filled. "Father." Was it just his imagination? He often thought of the boy, especially since his son was about to turn 10 years old in just a few days. He strained his audios as if expecting to hear something else, but empty silence filled the space around him. He continued on his way and arrived on the bridge. He sat in his command chair and was rather distracted thinking about his youngest son. The Kaleesh cyborg was loath to even think about what his son must be enduring at the hands of Count Dooku. He kept reminding himself that this was the only way that Zikolov would learn to be a powerful Force user. He sure as hell wasn't going to allow a filthy Jedi to train his son. Besides, once his son was fully trained using the Force and after he had learned advanced lightsaber combat, he planned on recruiting his child to help him destroy Dooku and the accursed Jedi. The father in him thought fondly of Zikolov, and Grievous had actually been quite the devious one in planting a surveillance droid within Dooku's fortress to keep tabs on his son. The surveillance droid was in fact disguised as one of Dooku's numerous protocol droids he kept around his lair, and the Sith Lord should be none the wiser in detecting it. The general had modified and altered the droid's programming, giving it a dual function. If and when the surveillance droid witnessed an actual assassination attempt on his child's life, it would activate its secondary programming, none other than a commando assassin protocol. The Kaleesh cyborg had of course installed actual parameters within its processor, accounting for the fact that his child would suffer physical injuries and had to program which actions were considered harsh training tactics and punishments as compared to any real murderous intentions. Revis chuckled to himself at the cleverness of it all. It took quite a bit of work to create this one-of-a-kind droid. Its outer shell was indeed that of a protocol droid. But once the secondary program activated within the central processor chip installed within the shielded portion of its cranial unit, the outer protocol-disguised shell would virtually come apart at the seams and reveal the thin, lithe, most lethal form of his very creative and most capable guardian-turned-assassin. Grievous ensured that if and when that event were ever to occur, it would emit an emergency beacon that would alert the general of the droid armies to come to his son's rescue. He sat back in his chair and ordered the fleet to jump to hyperspace. His son was not alone in that hellish, pit-forsaken place, and he had faith that Sokolov would be safe for the time being. His surveillance droid would send him a discreet report within the next 12 hours. Right now, the Jedi-slaying, Supreme Commander of the droid armies, had a planet to conquer.